Hi, and welcome. Today we talk with Kenneth McElroy. He's the co-founder and director of the Caithness Broch Project. You might not have heard of it, but I guarantee you'll want to check out their website. In this podcast, I talk to scholars, amateurs, academics, students, and so many more. It's so great to hear their passion for the topic. And you might have noticed that not all episodes here are Canadian, but I am. I'm Rosie. I'm a francophone from Canada, and this is my podcast. I guess now we're going into some Scottish history, hey? Today I'm talking with Kenneth from the Caithness Broch Project, and it's so funny how we got in touch through Twitter. I've been following the page for a while, and he was worried that people wouldn't know what a broch was. So thankfully, he agreed to come on the podcast and help us understand a little bit what a broch is. So thank you for being here, Kenneth. I really appreciate it.
That's not a problem at all, Rosie. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm really excited. So today, well, I mentioned a little bit, but what did you want to talk about today? What's your topic?
Well, today I'm going to be talking about brochs mainly, as well as an archaeological charity which I co-founded in 2013 called the Caithness Broch Project, which is attempting to rebuild one of these structures.
Excellent. Okay. I guess we can start right at the beginning. So we can start with the time period. What time period are we looking at when we talk about brochs?
Okay, so we are looking at the Iron Age, and that's kind of specifically the British Iron Age, if you like, because there's different Iron Ages across Europe and indeed across the world. But the kind of Iron Age for Scotland and for the UK started sometime around kind of 800 BC, but brochs were built from around about 400 BC to about 200 AD. That's when they stopped kind of being used. I think they stopped being built about 100 AD actually. And the difficulty with kind of understanding brochs is that it depends on what your version of a broch is, because there are very similar structures, and there's structures which are broch-like, and you get structures which are very definitely a broch, but some structures are not quite a broch. So it's sometimes difficult to delineate what's a broch and what isn't, and when kind of this kind of tradition of building brochs began. But generally, we're talking 400 BC to about 100 AD, 200 AD. So that's about 2,000 years ago.
Yes. And what was happening in sort of the timeline of history in that time in Scotland? You know, what was going on that would create these structures?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I don't think archaeology has quite answered it yet, because there are various theories as to what brochs were used for and why they were built. The best example of a broch can be found on Shetland, and it's called Musa. So if anyone wants to see what a broch looks like, then they can go and look at it. And what it is essentially is a very impressive dry stone tower, which often, or it could reach up to the height of over 40 feet high. That's just the structure. On top of that, you'd maybe have a 20-foot roof as well, possibly, if they were roofed. So when you look at a broch, you would immediately think that these are very impressive, very foreboding, perhaps, structures on the landscape. Ones that certainly kind of would signal some kind of power or perhaps a defensive reason. So there's maybe strategic reasoning behind the construction of brochs, but there could be kind of a wider societal reason for the construction as well. It could essentially just be kind of statements of power. Or the other thing is, you might want to consider the kind of worsening kind of climate at the time, which meant that farming was becoming more difficult. People are farming less on the uplands of Scotland and they're moving down the valleys. And so perhaps they're consolidating resources, consolidating power. This is also a time when you see hill forts, enclosed settlements, duns. Duns are quite similar to brochs in construction. You see these dotted all around the landscape of Scotland. And it's almost as a kind of crystallization of tribes, of societies, kind of a pre-kingdom era where people are consolidating their power. But there are myriad theories into why these structures were being built at the time.
Were there any particular landscapes where they tended to be built?
Well, essentially they're found largely across the north and west of Scotland, and in particular in Caithness. You'll also find many in, say, the Western Isles, Sutherland, Orkney, Shetland. You'll find a handful in Angus, which is towards the south of Scotland, and you'll find, 7 or 8 in the kind of south of Scotland as well. So you'll find, I think, at least 2 down in the borders, Eden's Hall being one of them. These are quite notable and later constructions as well. I think what I've found with Brochs is that they're always near a source of water. So you'll always find them kind of near rivers, near burns, as we might call them, kind of small streams. But they are dotted across the landscape. So they are found everywhere, so ranging from kind of inland kind of locations to very iconic kind of hilltop locations as well. So they are found everywhere, and certainly when you come to Caithness, wherever you can throw a stone, it's likely to land on a broch. There are around about 200 brochs in Caithness alone, so that's quite a significant number to find in one county.
That's incredible. And how big of a landscape is Caithness, like size-wise? How many kilometres or miles are we talking about?
I can't quite remember off the top of my head. I know that it's big. It maybe not in Canadian standards. It's probably not that big. I think it's 1,500 kind of square kilometres, something like that. So it's not an insignificant size, and it's certainly one of the kind of larger regions in Scotland.
Yes, when you said a stone's throw, you're not kidding then, if there's 200 brochs in that area. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically any kind of hill that you might see is possibly a broch. Caithness is notoriously flat. It's like kind of the lowlands beyond the highlands. And so a lot of these bumps in the grit and kind of almost like tors, it may be a broch.
Mm-hmm. And how did we discover brochs? Like, how did we understand that they're a different type of archaeology?
I'm not sure who did the first excavation of a broch. I know that actually, interestingly enough, brochs are kind of one of these great levelers in terms of kind of gender, because one of a really early archaeologist in Scotland's history is Christine McLagan, who actually excavated or discovered a broch near Stirling. That was sometime in the late 19th century, by which point there was a kind of flourishing of archaeology. Back then it was kind of became known as antiquarianism. Largely kind of well-educated, more affluent people just digging up remains that were sometimes in their estate or nearby. And these were often enacted by more well-to-do members of society, school teachers, reverends, for example. They would be often lead excavation. So it wasn't quite excavation as we now know it, which is a kind of meticulous scientific process. Back then it was more Indiana Jones style, looking for gold and bones and interesting things. But certainly in Caithness, one of the earliest proponents of excavation was Alexander Henry Rind, who excavated Kettleburn Broch, I believe it is. I think it's the 1870s, I want to say. And he became really notable in his excavation of Egyptian sites as well. So he was trained in Caithness and then transferred his skills to Egypt. On top of that, there is quite a notable broch excavator, if you can call it that, by the name of Francis Tress Barry, who again was one of these well-to-do, very wealthy landowners in Caithness. He'd made his riches off things like that. He was an MP at one point too. But he had land in Caithness. He owned Keith Castle and the kind of sort of environs, if you like. He led around about 14 excavations in 14 years of broch sites. And that's a mind-blowing number if you are an archaeologist, because to give another example, Martin Carruthers of the UHI has been excavating one broch for 10 years. So again, Tress Barry was not quite excavating in the manner as we know it. It was much more clandestine. But he came from a kind of background of mining, so he was going for it when he was excavating. So there is a historic tradition of excavating brochs in Scotland where you can find them. And it's something that's been ongoing for nearly 150 years. It was also originally thought that brochs were Viking in origin. They also became to be known as Picts' houses. Now, the Picts were a conglomeration of people in Scotland who could be found across the area, and that is kind of from a much later date. We're talking about maybe 400 AD onwards to about 1000 AD. That's when we might refer to the Pictish peoples of Scotland. So these are actually, they're about 1,000 years out of date. But there's been several advancements. Several archaeologists have been responsible for excellent excavations of brochs. Charles Thomas, Horace Fairhurst, Andy Heald, for example, of AOC Archaeology. Brochs have long held a deep fascination and interest for archaeologists for the best part of 150 years.
Yes, absolutely. It's quite amazing, actually, that, we're still learning about them. That's really incredible.
There is a lot to be learned about Brochs, and they're not going to give up their secrets so easily, I'm afraid. But that's part of the fun of archaeology, I think.
I guess we can talk about maybe what a typical, I know that in archaeology it's difficult to talk about typical things, but, what would be a typical structure that we're looking at?
Well, my co-founder Ian McLean, whom we founded the project back in 2013, he likes to use this sort of analogy of if I were to ask 10 people in a room to draw a cat, they'd all draw a cat, but it'd be slightly different. So Brochs are basically the same thing. They are kind of variations on a theme. They're all circular. They have two walls. They're dry stone, and when I say that, I mean that they are built without the likes of mortar or cement. So they're just stones placed on top of each other, a bit like Lego, if you like. These circular structures they batter inwards in terms of their shape. So if you can think of if you think of the Simpsons, where Homer works, those nuclear kind of towers, they're a bit shaped like that. That's the best way to describe them. And as you enter the Broch, there is an entrance in the front. You might find at your right-hand side there is a kind of cell built within the walls. And this is a corbelled cell where the stones kind of overlap one another, forming a kind of beehive shape. You'll find, might find 2 or 3 of these cells in the Broch structure. And then if you kind of look to your left, you might find that there's a set of stairs running through the structure as well. So this would suggest that the buildings were multi-storied. So we're talking about kind of skyscrapers back in 2,000 years ago. And we also suspect that they were multi-storied because there's evidence of what's known as a scarcement ledge. Now that's essentially just a ledge of stones which juts out, kind of protruding inwards, if you like. And this would have been used potentially to support a floor, which is, again, it's just fantastic to think that people were living on multi-story constructions in the Iron Age. There's more intriguing elements of Brochs as well, such as voids, which run sometimes from the bottom of the Broch to the top. It's not known what these are for. These are essentially just gaps in the Broch structure, in the inner wall. We really don't know what these were used for. It may have been some sort of chimney, if you like, which could have then helped to heat up the Broch structure. There is some science behind that, but I am by no means qualified to talk my way through that, I'm afraid. Or we don't really know. It could have been a kind of structural kind of composition type thing. It could have been an engineering part, maybe to lighten the loads at kind of areas where the Broch was deemed weak. So the people who built these structures they knew what they were doing. And these are really complex and just totally fascinating buildings that are quite difficult to pin down what a Broch is. And as I say, most Brochs kind of follow that general theme which I just described, circular, 2 walls. But some have kind of different sized entrances, some maybe slightly squatter, might have thicker walls. Some have triangular lintels over the entrances as well, so it's a kind of just a fancy doorway, if you like. We don't know if they were all multi-storied. We don't know if some of them stood the test of time. We don't know, for instance, how the interior may have looked because the archaeology just isn't there anymore. If it was made from the likes of wood or perhaps reed and wattle and daub, things like that, then these things generally don't or aren't preserved in the archaeological record. So it's difficult to understand what went on inside. And the other big question in Broch archaeology is, were these things roofed? I would say, having spent many years living in Scotland, I would definitely not want to live in an unroofed structure. So I would posit that they were roofed, but what form that roof took is difficult to pin down. It could have been reeds, thrushes, a kind of thatched roof type structure. It could have been, perhaps it could have been slates of some description. I know that Neil Ackerman, who also works in Orkney, he has done sort of investigation into Neolithic houses, which appear to have been slated. So they're all quite similar to a certain degree, but they definitely differ Broch to Broch. And the atypical Broch Musa, whilst very resplendent and looks absolutely fantastic, I think it's Noel Fodget who says that Musa is a Broch, but not every Broch is a Musa. So there's variations in terms of Broch archaeology and what constitutes a Broch and what doesn't. And I think a lot of it stems from this tradition of dry stone diking, which began thousands and thousands of years ago in the Neolithic age, when people started to build kind of these great chamber cairns where relatives and ancestors were essentially, their bones were deposited for safekeeping or for spiritual reasons. We don't really know why. But this kind of tradition of dry stone diking carries on right through until we start seeing huts being built, not only from kind of just simple posts in the ground, but then they start adding stones in a kind of circular fashion. And then these houses get thicker, and then they start to incorporate more features such as the stairwells, such as the corbelled cells. And, we start to see things like Crosskirk, which is a broch in Caithness, which, for reasons unknown to me, was bulldozed off the edge of a cliff, because I think it was seen as a dangerous kind of site if people were to visit it. But it still seems like a tragic waste of a broch, if you ask me. But that's kind of viewed as one of the earliest brochs, because it has this stairway running through the structure. It has kind of stone partitioning furniture, if you like, within the broch structure. It has evidence of cells, things like that. But prior to Crosskirk, there were structures such as How Broch with quotation marks, in Orkney, which is this kind of oblong shape, not quite a square, not quite a circle, with really thick walls. And I think it's got maybe a cell incorporated into it somewhere as well. And so at this point, it's just very difficult to understand or delineate what makes a broch and what doesn't. It's a complicated topic, actually.
I feel like generally it would be sort of a more round structure than a square structure. It seems like that was sort of a more typical.
Brochs are absolutely, they're circular in shape. I think what's common in most brochs is that they have these two walls and a stairwell running through. And generally speaking, these were kind of monumental structures. These were big, imposing, impressive, awesome structures too. So they have to be of a certain size to qualify for that kind of broch name, if you like.
It almost feels like the tower of a castle without the castle, right?
Yeah, it's often described as a kind of proto-castle, just given the sheer size and monumentality of these brochs. And they're kind of multifunction as well, multifaceted constructions. We don't really know if they were used as dwellings, if they were... some people have posited that they may have been kind of factories of some description as well. At Clachtall Broch, there's an ongoing excavation that may have stopped now, I think. But certainly over the last couple of years, they've been excavating this broch, which had collapsed inwards at some point in history. I think actually what happened is about 2,000 years ago, there was a fire, and this eventually ran out, and the place just collapsed in on itself. That's left a kind of wonderful state of preservation. But at Clachtall, there's a huge number of Quernstones instruments which were used, kind of just essentially two flat kind of circular shaped stones, one on top of the other, which was used to process grain, basically, or barley. They split them up so that they could be turned into bread, things like that. There's about 12 of them, as far as I can remember, that have been recovered from the site. And that's just quite a phenomenal number, really. And whether that was just kind of the lower portion of the broch, the first floor or the ground floor, if you like, they were undertaking kind of industrial activities, or perhaps, animal husbandry, or who knows, something rigorous and kind of robust like that. And perhaps in the second floor, people were weaving, or maybe that's where people slept. We don't really have the archaeology to go on that, but it is interesting to think that these weren't just homes, or they might not just have been homes. They could have been centres of activity themselves.
That's really interesting. Yeah. You know how you're saying maybe the middle has like a fire? It almost makes me think like a smoke shack. You have meats and stuff, and you prepare your meats and you keep them away from other animals.
Yeah. And there's a really good illustration. Type in broch illustration, you'll get it. I can't quite remember who did it, but I think it is actually of Duncarloway, where they're kind of hanging fish from the rafters, if you like, or from around the circular scaffold, and they just hang fish from there. And it would make sense. If you've got to utilise space, then if you eat fish and you like your fish smoked, then you've got to smoke them somehow, so why not use the hearth? So, these are all just theories that we can't really prove. But I suppose when we come to build our broch, you will kind of find out a bit more about what works and what doesn't work.
So if we're looking at brochs, they're all over Scotland, as you've said, in the north and the outer edges and the Isles. Mm-hmm. Do we see a commonality in the types of stones, or are they using more the local quarries that they have?
They are using the local quarries, as far as I know. In Caithness, for instance, we'll be using the Caithness flagstone, which was famous the world over. It's easily split into kind of chunks, if you like, and is perfect for building material, for dry stone diking, for laying stones on top of each other, basically. They're not using one quarry for all the brochs in Scotland. It's, I suppose, very different to the likes of, say, Stonehenge, where you've got a quarry many, many miles away being used for this particular structure. And with brochs, it's much more a case of just using what you've got. And I suppose that in some way that answers why Caithness has so many brochs, is the fact that stone was such a prevalent building material, given that trees were not so, didn't really flourish in Caithness, being that it's too flat and it's too windy, so trees inevitably don't really grow there so well as the kind of peat conditions And if you have a lot of people there using the wood, then there's not going to be a lot of it. So what they turn to instead is using stone. That's perhaps the reason why Caithness has such a rich legacy of Brochs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do we have evidence, or do we understand a little bit of the type of people that went through the Brochs?
Yeah, I think that there's plenty of evidence for reuse, but we'll talk about the people who were built and inhabited these Brochs at the kind of zenith. These were just known as the Iron Age peoples of Scotland, if you can call it Scotland at that time. And there's plenty of evidence, and I guess the evidence from the Broch structures as well allows us to kind of at least suggest that these were used as dwellings, as houses. We don't know if it was maybe a house for one person or if it was for accommodating several families. But there certainly is kind of the day-to-day accoutrements that you might find in your own house. You'll find things for making clothes, for weaving, for making foods. We'll find things such as at Clachtall, where you find the Quernstones. This is all kind of evidence of people living and doing things in Brochs, from cooking to making things. You find things like candle holders, or what's thought to be candle holders. Again, I think that's been found at Clachtall, but also in the cairns. And you find a lot of things that are more difficult to define and might give you an idea, or might sort of just hint at ideas of belief and perhaps social lives and spirituality, things like that. We find things like, certainly in Caithness, and 2 Brochs in Caithness, and 3 Brochs in Caithness, Keys, Kirktofts and Whitegate Broch, we found these painted pebbles. And they're exactly as they sound. They are just these kind of beach pebbles which have been painted with quite striking designs, kind of spotted or kind of wavy designs as well. They're really quite beautiful. We don't know what they were for. They're a bit like these carved stone balls that you might see as well. Essentially, their meaning and their use and everything about them has just been lost to time. But they're found there, so they had a use and a meaning for the people who lived there. We also find things like at the Pap, I think, was it Hillhead? So at Hillhead Broch, near Wick, they found evidence of what looks, again, might have been some sort of medical procedure, which was trepanning, which is drilling holes into people's heads. So there's a fragment of a skull with a hole bored into it, or 3 holes bored into it, sorry. We don't know what that was for, if that was medical, again, if that was spiritual, if there was, perhaps this man had demons inside him for all we know, or was thought to have demons inside him, and this was a way of exorcising them out, or if he had a really bad headache, then maybe that was a way of dealing with it. I would suggest boring a hole into your skull is not going to relieve you of that headache, mind you. But there's lots of things found in Brochs which give a really intricate picture of day-to-day life through the ages. I could go on and talk about, say, the cairns and the amount of kind of metalworking implements that they find in their casts for brooches. But there's so much to talk about the inhabitants. But there's certainly a kind of rich legacy that they've left behind. And in terms of reuse, they are reused from, as far as I'm aware, immediately after they're kind of disbanded. And in a lot of cases, a lot of Brochs are, if you like, mutilated, and their shape changes and they become kind of outer buildings form around them as well. But certainly I'm aware of some Brochs being used right up until to the Viking Age. Perhaps not as houses, but perhaps as kind of places of ceremonial importance. I was speaking to you earlier about Thingsva Broch in Caithness, which, with a name like Thingsva, would suggest it was reused by the Vikings as a thing site. And thing sites are essentially assembly fields, or if you like, Viking parliaments almost. So it'd be really interesting to see, if there's any kind of archaeological evidence for their reuse. But with a name like Thingsva, it would certainly suggest that the Norse saw these sites as kind of important places to be reused. And in a sense, knowing that these Broch sites, or what remained of them, were probably important to the ancestors of the Broch builders. They were probably viewed with perhaps some superstition. In many ways, they resembled chambered cairn sites as well, which, because you're burying dead people at chambered cairn sites, they will obviously carry that kind of supernatural, spooky kind of aura with them too. So by reusing them as a kind of Viking parliament, the Vikings were asserting their control over the area by, really utilising these areas and these structures, or what remained of them.
So you've mentioned quite a few different things that we've found and that we've noticed. When we look at Brochs, how has the archaeology or the process of finding these things out, like we just started, let's say, digging up, as you mentioned, in the 1800s, late 1800s, and what kind of technology are we using now? How has that changed?
Well, I think the great leap for archaeology came with radiocarbon dating, which is a complicated scientific process that, again, I don't think I would do any justice in trying to explain, but essentially allows us to date organic materials by burning it, and it gives off a carbon kind of number, which can then be traced to a certain period. That has been crucial to understanding, when these brochs were built. So previously, we thought that they may have been picked houses. And if you look at an old map of Scotland, you may see a picked house, which is more than likely the remnants of an old broch. But we now know that brochs were much older, so dating to perhaps up to 400 BC, again, depending on your definition of a broch. So again, it's this kind of science, it's a lot more a scientific process. New archaeology, I think back, or processual archaeology as it was called many years ago. But there's various kind of scientific processes and analysis that you can use to help with the understanding of a broch structure or the people who use them. So isotope analysis as well is another one which allows people to kind of positively date and understand, for instance, even the diet of some people. There's a really notable example of isotope analysis being used for another Caithness archaeological kind of project called the Achavanich Beaker Burial Project, about a Bronze Age woman who was found in a kist burial. And so here they're using isotope analysis and strontium analysis to understand more about where this person came from and kind of what she ate and how she lived. So the science of archaeology has really helped to understand brochs more. And there are other processes as well involved in archaeology and understanding brochs. So LIDAR, for instance, or geophysics, they help us to identify structures below the ground without even having to put a spade into the earth. And these are really important in just kind of understanding the landscape and kind of identifying broch structures and where we might expect to find them. So it's, far removed from the Tres Barry days of digging down as deep as you can, as quick as you can, in the hope of finding something interesting.
And how did you get interested in broch?
Well, I don't really know how I got interested in brochs per se. I think I've always been interested in archaeology and history and things like that. My dad would take me around historical sites as a bairn, and I've got one photograph of me and Scarra Bray wearing an England rugby top for some strange reason. I'm not sure, that seems very cruel. A cruel prank to play on a young Scottish lad. But I was certainly always aware of the kind of archaeology of Caithness. In 2013, myself and Ian McLean, we kind of knew that there was, there's fantastic archaeological sites in the area, but they just weren't being utilised. They weren't being promoted to the extent that we thought they could be. And this was the same time as Dounreay, which is the local nuclear power plant in the area, was starting to, or had for many years, to be fair, it was going through a process of, and still is, going through a process of decommissioning. So it was one of the first kind of fast reactors or nuclear reactors in the UK. It was built sometime in the 1950s. But it served its purpose and it's now being taken apart essentially. And with that, unfortunately, it's going to take with it a lot of jobs. The population of Caithness is somewhere around 20,000, and I think Dounreay employs around about 2,000. So it's really crucial to the area, in fact. Now, with the downturn of Dounreay, that's going to see a decrease in population. Caithness is predicted to lose about 20% of its population in the next 20 years, which is frankly an astonishing and frightening number for anywhere to lose. If you can imagine, say, for instance, if Toronto was predicted to lose 20% of its population, there'd be uproar. It would just be seen as a real kind of scandal almost, or a real problem. So this is what Caithness is facing at the moment. And so myself and Ian have looked at the likes of, say, Orkney, which has thousands of tourists step onto its shores every year. As a great example, in 2015, when I worked there, 12 cruise ships visited Caithness. In Orkney, it was about 150 cruise ships, which is an astonishing number. Obviously, this comes with its own problems, but what's clear is Orkney does benefit from its heritage tourism. It makes something like, I want to say, £36 million from tourism every year. It's a fantastic number. And these tourists aren't going to stop anytime soon, and hopefully not with the current situation. So we believe that Caithness is just not promoting itself as well as it should be, and it has such a vast, rich archaeological landscape anyway that it's in the perfect position to promote itself. So myself and Ian got together. We realised that we both had an interest in archaeology, and we kind of understood that Caithness had more brochs than anywhere else in Scotland, and for the world for that matter. And so we thought that this would be a great kind of totem, if you like, for Caithness, a great icon for Caithness, and would serve to draw people in to the area. And we thought, well, let's actually give them something really worth, unmissable, something iconic that you've got to see, a world-class attraction. We thought, why not build a broch? So that's what we're trying to do. And it's been a slow process from 2013, from just a Facebook page talking about brochs, talking about archaeology of Caithness, to setting up an archaeological charity, to a membership scheme, to the various projects that we've done throughout the years, all in the hope of kind of encouraging interest and awareness of the archaeology of the region, not to just tourists or potential tourists, but to the local community too, so that they feel part of it and they feel that they have a kind of identity, if you like, which can be attached to brochs. We've kind of been taking a step-by-step procedure to get to even a kind of starting position of building this broch, because we're still a long way off, unfortunately, but it's something that's not been done in 2,000 years, and unfortunately now has kind of 2,000 years of kind of bureaucracy and restrictions and limitations placed upon it now as well. I don't think the Iron Age builders would have had so much red tape around building a broch as we do now. So it's a very slow, staggered process, but we are making quite good progress.
And you've mentioned that there's cairns also near the broch. So I guess what other types of things could people expect to see in Caithness if they do end up visiting?
Well, if they do end up visiting, that would be fantastic, and I'm sure they wouldn't be disappointed, because it's probably not what they're going to expect, actually. It's very un-Scottish in many ways, and I would say that it's uncompromisingly beautiful. It's very flat, but in my own opinion, that doesn't really unduly bother me, because the coastal scenery is just magnificent. So you might expect to see geological wonders such as the stacks of Duncan's Bay, these huge, essentially stacks of rock in the water, always a tourist favourite. And nearby to these places as well, you get to see the puffins, which delight and amuse people to no end. And I still love seeing them as well. They're absolutely brilliant wee things. There's also a huge array of castles as well, some of the best castles in Scotland, in my own opinion, and just really Instagram-worthy shots at these places. Keith's Castle, Sinclair Garnagle Castle, Pacoli Castle, Thurso Castle, and even kind of more, if you like, visitor-friendly castles, such as the Castle of May, which was frequented by the Queen Mother and is still visited by Prince Charles every year. A fantastic place to visit. But there's so much to see and do in Caithness, whether you like whiskey, whether you like gin, whether you like great food and drink, fishing, whether you like coastal scenery, castles, northern lights, wildlife. There's so much to see and do in Caithness, and I really would encourage anyone who's not been to go and experience it for yourself.
And you've mentioned a little bit about your project and how you want to build a broch. So what were the sort of all the aims of the project? Where do you see it go in the next 10 or even 20 years?
Well, so the project to build a replica broch has always been the kind of mainstay of the flagship of the project. And it has been ongoing, I guess, since 2013, when it was just an idea. And from there, we've, for instance, in 2016, got a kind of preliminary business plan, which would suggest that by building this, it would be a successful venture, because you've got to build something which is, authentic and pleasing and still archaeologically sound, if you like. But it has to be balanced out with the fact that this is being built for a reason, and the reason is to shore up tourism in Caithness and to encourage people to come to Caithness. And so you also have to balance that out with, it's got to be a successful tourist venture. So it's difficult balancing the two worlds of Iron Age authenticity and striking the tourist market as well. So we recently, one of the biggest steps we took was a big call out for across Caithness for people who might be interested in ourselves purchasing their land, or even giving away the land in some instances, for the construction of this broch, because where this broch is going to be built is the most crucial part of the project. We need to know where the best place to build the broch is, essentially. So we're working with two firms, Hoskins Architects and Jura Consultants, and they're putting together what's known as a project development brief, and this essentially gives us a framework with which to work with and helps us identify where the best site to build the broch is. They'll also be looking at feasibility around it, a kind of another business plan to show it up, and perhaps some early visuals of the broch too. So once we have that, we will be in a better position to start fundraising for the actual project. Once we kind of identified how much money we might need to raise to purchase land and to build the broch. And this could be a multi-million-pound project, which is a big, that's quite a big thing to do. So we do need to take our time with it. But we're hoping within the next 2 years, we will be kind of in a position to start fundraising. Once we've got the broch built, we need to work with, say, Highland Council and the Scottish Government to make sure that our broch structure complies with all the kind of regulations that it needs to comply with. So I would hope that in the next 5 years, we'll be we might have built the broch by then. That would be incredibly exciting.
And when you're talking about building the broch, I'm guessing you're using sort of traditional ways to build it. As you said, there's no cement that's between the rocks, right?
Yeah. So I mean, another kind of reason for building this broch is not just for sort of tourist potential or kind of tourist visits, although that's probably and arguably the most important part of the project. Another part is actually this becomes a huge experimental piece of archaeology, and it helps us to understand how these brochs were built. We don't really know how they began to build these things. We have ideas, but we don't really know what's the easiest way, what's the quickest way, what's the best way, which way makes the broch kind of strongest or a kind of strong structure. Did they use scaffolding? How did they kind of use stone tools to kind of shape blocks? There's many questions that need to be asked by the construction of this broch, and we hope to do it as traditionally as possible. I think there's two really good examples that we can think of where kind of traditional experimental archaeology has been used. One is Guédelon Castle in France, which is an astounding project. If anyone going to Google and just have a look at what they're doing over there, it's mad. It's essentially the reconstruction of a kind of 13th century castle done with all the kind of tools and even the clothes and in the style that they would have done 700 years ago. And closer to home, there's the Scottish Crannog Centre as well. That's another fantastic project, one that we really love to talk about. Essentially, this was done as a piece of experimental archaeology, I think in the early 90s, late 80s, whereby they built a dwelling that's based on water called a crannog. It's essentially a roundhouse on stilts, if you like. And that was done through using experimental archaeology methods as well, to better understand how these things were constructed and why they were constructed as well. And after they'd constructed it, they turned it into a kind of tourist attraction in its own right. And I would thoroughly recommend anyone checks those two projects out to get a better idea of how we're going to do our own project and why we're doing this as well.
I was just going to say that I wish I had heard about this a long time ago.
That's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, there's people in Caithness who haven't heard of this project, so that always grinds my gears whenever I hear people go, "Oh no, I've never heard of the Caithness Broch Project." And we've been on the television, we've been on papers, we've been on radio, we've been on national television, on like prime time television shows, and people haven't heard of us. But that's archaeology. It's going to interest some people, and it's not going to interest others. And as fun and cool as I think I am on Twitter, it's still archaeology, and it's still sometimes incredibly difficult to engage with people who just aren't interested,
Or they don't know that they'd be interested.
Well, that's it. I think, as one of the volunteers said, you can only care about something that you know about. So that's part of the battle, is just making them aware of it. And if you wanted to, we could talk about, how we've kind of maybe approached that, because it started as a Facebook page, because that's a cheap, easy, quick means of communicating your message to anyone. And, we use other social media like Twitter and Instagram. But we had no real idea as to how interested people were about this project. But, doing kind of talks and outreach events, things like that. One of our first projects, I feel like, was raising some money to install some interpretation panels at 3 Broch sites, which didn't have any interpretation. So when visitors went there was nothing to tell them what these things were. So we thought, okay, this is a good first idea, which will, essentially enable us to start a kind of portfolio of successful projects, because we'd love to just get £1 million from funding bodies, but they need to see that you are, resilient, that you are resourceful, that you are trustworthy, and that you can manage such massive, even small projects. And so the first project, we basically had to do a kind of pitching competition for our idea. And, as an archaeological group or an archaeological charity, this was kind of community event, so there were other charities, other groups there who were also kind of pleading for money. And, we're talking age concern, kids sports groups, disability groups, kind of medical groups as well, arts groups. And we thought, there's no way we're going to win any money here. And actually, at that, we got all the money that we needed, and we actually got 80% of the vote. So I think our project really means a lot to people in Caithness, and I think they're well aware of the kind of issues that hamper the region, whether that just be kind of rural isolation to the kind of prospect of such a significant loss of jobs through Doonry. So that was a really buoyant kind of first step into doing projects and doing events in the region. And since then, we've done lots of things. We've done archaeological digs at 3 Broch sites across the county, which I think about 150 people took part in over the course of kind of 3 weeks. In 2017, we also had a Lego Broch made, which was 10,000 pieces, I believe. I didn't count them all, but I was told there was 10,000 pieces. This was made by a team called Bricked the Past, who are really great. They do Hadrian's Wall, they do kind of London in the 19th century, they've done Culloden, kind of battlefield and castles and things like that. Really fantastic. But they made this Broch as part of it was called a Home of the Broch exhibition at Caithness Horizons, which was the then kind of museum for Caithness. Well, I think we got about 3,000 visitors through the door over summer, which I was really pleased with, and we got lots of really great feedback, talking about the kind of exhibits and displays that we had there. We did outreach events with children as well, so we encouraged them we basically took them from school to come in and look at the Lego Broch, and then we challenged them to build the Lego Broch on Minecraft. And it's fantastic to see them really learn and really understand the basic structure, the kind of basic components of a Broch. That's something like 800 children in a week. And one of the children said about the Lego Broch that this is the best Lego Broch ever, the best Lego Broch in the world. And I thought that was a great piece of feedback until my friend pointed out that it was also the only Lego Broch in the world. So didn't feel so good about that after then. But we've done lots. I think we've spoken to over 100 community groups. We've done, as I say, outreach events. We've done Lego Broch, done exhibitions. And then that's kind of culminated in the last couple of years with our biggest project to date, which is the conservation of an existing Broch called Owsdale Burn Broch, or Altaburg Broch in Gaelic. It's probably Caithness's best example of a Broch. And we visited it in 2015, and we saw that it had kind of collapsed. It was essentially excavated in 1891, and a buttress had been kind of constructed inside the Broch to kind of, I guess, protect the structure. That buttress subsequently collapsed, even though it was only 200 years old. The rest of the 2,000-year-old structure is more or less standing, but it was in real danger of, a few winters would see it kind of collapse. So we put together a funding package, and with the help of SSE, Historic Environment Scotland, and the Caithness Highland Leader Fund, we were able to get funds together to conserve the Broch and ensure that it's safe for people to visit it, and also install a path down to the Broch, because it was quite difficult to get down there. Actually, it's quite a steep path to get there, as well as create parking, signage, and interpretation panels as well. So that was £180,000. So we've come a long way from 2015 when we did our interpretation panels, which I think were about it was a £2,000 project, and we're now dealing with hundreds of thousands of pounds. And all of this really is in aid of the kind of the next big project, which is the reconstruction of the Broch itself.
Yeah, that's that's really incredible. You've come a very long way in a short time, actually.
Yeah, no, it's been quite a journey, and I think I've learned so much from it myself, and I kind of personally and professionally. You know, I'm now studying archaeology at Glasgow University in my final year, and I was really flattered as well because I gave a talk at their winter seminar series for Glasgow University, and every other kind of person on that list was a doctor or a professor or a PhD student. And there was me in my second year undergrad. And I think I was the first person to do a talk in their undergrad at their series. So I was delighted, but I know that this project it's possibly like, transformational for Caithness. It's really piqued the attention of people across the world. We have members from Bulgaria to Finland to Canada to America, Australia, and many other places. And, this means an awful lot to Caithness as well. And I really believe that it's what Caithness deserves. So I think that, once people come here and seeing a Broch as it was 2,000 years ago, again, a real vivid living history experience is something that stays with you for many years. And I think through that, you can teach them, how people lived, who these people were, why they did these sort of things. And I think by, really showing off with the construction of a replica Broch is a great way to engage with people and give them an experience, like I say, that will last and kind of live with them for a long, long time.
So is there going to be a small museum to go with the Broch? Is that sort of in the plans to help people understand a little better?
Well, yeah, that's something we've been looking at. Now, that's part of the kind of project development brief, which I mentioned we were working with some consultants to develop, because we don't know how are we going to do it and what is the best way of going about it. Should we have a museum? Should it just be a Broch and maybe a little hut to encourage people, like a wee admission stall, if you like? Or should we have like a really beautiful, kind of innovative, maybe architecturally beautiful visitor centre in itself? I think a project of this scale and this scope probably does deserve equally beautiful and complex visitor centre, such as, the Culloden battlefield experience, for example. I think is a real fantastic example of a way that historic site can meld in with something new and something important. And so we might have a visitor centre there. In all likelihood, we will, and hopefully it will become as much of the experience as the Broch visit itself too.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. This was fantastic to hear you speak about Brochs in general and then your actual project. And I really hope to visit it someday. I'm really excited to go visit Caithness now.
Oh, please do, yeah. And all the whiskey distilleries, gin distilleries, and they're all waiting to be visited. And of course, our Broch will be ready by that point. Even if you can't make it, then please do, continue to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our website. And I should also mention that people can help support us from even in Canada. They can support us for completely free as well. They can become a friend of the project. So you just need to go to our website, www.thebrochproject.co.uk, and sign up as a friend. It takes 30 seconds and you get a nice newsletter out of it every now and then. And we do appreciate everyone who signs up. But no, thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. All the best to you.
Thank you.
That was very educational and yet very entertaining. Thank you so much, Kenneth. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and record this on the podcast. And Kenneth had 2 book recommendations today: Towers of the North by Ian Armitt and Caithness Archaeology, Aspects of Prehistory by Andy Held and John Barber. And of course, that will be in the show notes. You can find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, @HistoryA. You can come to the website, historya.com. And if you get a chance to rate this podcast on your podcasting platform of choice, I'd really appreciate it. It helps people find me, so thank you. I'd like to thank my husband Jamie and our brood of kids, our family, our friends, and all of the teachers who helped me adventure through history. Un grand merci.